Well, hello again, everybody. This is John Norris of Trading Perspectives. As always, we have our good friend Sam Clement. Sam, say hello.
How's it going?
Sam, I'm doing okay. As you know, this past weekend I went to Charleston, South Carolina. Spent a little time with my daughter over there. My wife and I, family, had a pretty good time. However, one thing I did notice, a little bit more so than I have noticed around here recently, is there seem to be more and more people, dare I say, with masks back over their face, largely because, from what I've heard, what I've read, there seems to be a surge in COVID going around.
There does seem to have been a surge, and when we first talking about this as the topic, I tried to think back of the last time where COVID was really a major talking point.
Yeah, to me it has been a while.
I can't even. I mean, obviously, I could say 2020 and 2021.
No, but in terms of
I can't tell you the last time recently that's been a major discussion point.
I don't think I've talked about it at all in 2023 until maybe this week.
Yeah, that's what I was kind of getting at. I can't remember a time this calendar year, where it's been that big of a topic.
So when all of a sudden it's not a news item and then it becomes a news item again and you start seeing people wearing masks again, is it just a matter of time before someone at the CDC or in Washington, Atlanta, or what have you decides, mask up guys, here comes round two?
They may decide to do that, but I don't think that is something that Americans are willing to stomach anymore. It's just, we've gone through it, we've seen the data, and people are honestly, I think it changed people's perceptions around sickness, vaccines, masks, diseases, all that stuff. I even saw an article yesterday saying that the amount of vaccines that people are getting for their dogs has decreased significantly. So it is, I think, irreparably changed our psychology around sickness, disease, and prevention.
Well, also, would you say that perhaps it is arguably or inarguably, as the case may be, change the way we feel, and dare I say, our respect for maybe the CDC?
I think maybe for kind of all governments, I mean, government organization, GSOs, or even the federal government itself. I mean, I think you've seen, I mean, obviously a lot of people have had disdain for different politicians, and we've talked about it, the data and the trust that people have in institutions, what have you, in the federal government being at lows. I think across the board, government organizations, the government itself, I think it is, again, I think it's inarguable that it's caused irreparable damage. I think it's caused people to push away from politics as a whole and not to a certain party. I just think, I still think we're in the early innings of, seeing how badly we managed a lot of the past couple of years in the irreparable damage it's caused.
Well, now that we have at least maybe a little bit of precedent, do you think that perhaps the next go-around, if there is another go-around, that the powers that be, the governments on every level, might not be as incompetent as they were this past go-around?
That, to me, seems kind of like wishful thinking, that they would learn from mistakes. I would like to say yes, and I'd like to say, look at some of the Baltic countries and how they responded to it and what have you. And but again, yeah, I think that's kind of wishful thinking to think, hey, we're gonna learn from our mistakes from the past time and handle it differently.
Now, I could be completely wrong, but my understanding of Gen Z, your generation, and sometimes I have to not put you in that generation in some way, some form or fashion, but it seems to me, just from the articles I read online, it doesn't matter where it is, it seems as though your generation, more so than I would argue mine, doesn't mind government interference into their daily lives anywhere near as much as mine does. So when you've talked to other people your age, your friends, in terms of mask mandates, all that bad stuff back in the day, what was the general take amongst your friends? Did they enjoy government coming in and saying, you've got to do this, you've got to do that? Were they kind of arms in the air, hands in the air last time? How do you think your generation would respond to subsequent lockdowns and mask mandates?
Well, if I need to be excluded from my generation, then the whole birds of a feather, I'm sure the people I associate with would probably need to be excluded as well. But, I think that you have to, a part of it when you talk about my generation, I don't necessarily think it's my generation. I think it's people of the age that my generation has been in, especially during the pandemic.
Well, listen, you guys have had life's thrown you guys a curveball, as well as, I guess, Gen A. I think they're coming. But think about what your generation has gone through. Things that you remember, the financial crisis. That wasn't a lot of fun.
Yeah.
And pandemic. And, career-wise, hey, you've never seen the Fed really tightening rates and getting to a normal monetary policy. All you've seen is money just being thrown about. So when you kind of take a look at it, you have seen periods, a major stretch in your life B, the government's just involved in everything that we do. So maybe it's considered, your generation, a little bit more normal for the government to be doing this type of stuff. Whereas for me, this seems very abnormal and much more of government overreach than any I can remember of any time in my life.
Yeah, I guess the one thing you hit on, I realized recently, there's been more years since I've been working that the stock market has had a bear market than not, which I think is, again,
Well, which is unusual because, I got into the industry in '91. And for long years, throughout the entire '90s, people going, you kids, you don't even know what a bear market is. You don't even know what a down market is. I heard this at Mercantile Safe Deposit and Trust Company in Baltimore, Maryland. I heard this at Stern, Agee and Leach here in Birmingham, Alabama. I heard this wherever, that we didn't know what it was like to go through red ink, because in truth, we really hadn't. The markets always went up, 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 and up. And then all of a sudden we had 2000 and 2022. That was pretty much of a bear market.
Yeah.
So that was kind of a trial by fire. So it's interesting that you would say that, because starting out my career, wasn't any such thing as a bear market. Now we're kind of stumbling from volatility to volatility. The VIX index hasn't maybe gone back to where it was in years past, but even so, it's got to be confusing for you guys, because bad news seems to be good news. Take like the soft economic data here at the end of August, markets finally rally on it.
Yeah.
The rest of the time, decent economic data, markets selling off. So it seems like up is down and down is up when it comes to explaining to people your generation how this all works together.
things have, yes, I think our whole generation has grown up with more government overreach than prior generations. I think you could point all the way back to the response to 9/11 as kind of a start of more government overreach, which for most people in my generation, I don't know what the cutoff years are. That's pretty much their entire sentient life. What you can remember, is more government overreach than was previously around. And so I think we have grown up in it a lot. And I do think there's probably more people that maybe aren't okay with it, but don't realize how abnormal that is. And I think that's the issue when you grow up with something, you maybe don't realize, you don't even know maybe to ask the questions of, hey, this doesn't seem like it should be the way it is.
Well, also, maybe there is a generational difference, and maybe there is some just generational misunderstanding of the way the world's supposed to operate. Do you think that maybe there's also some regional differences? Because I'll tell you that back during the worst of the mask mandates and all that stuff, it seemed as though people in the southern United States were less likely to kind of go lemming-like into all the mandates, into the lockdowns, into the mask wearing and all that stuff. People complained about it a lot more, and frankly didn't follow the rules anywhere near as badly. And from what I can tell, the data doesn't suggest that people in Florida are any worse off because they weren't wearing a mask than the people in Massachusetts that were masked up and hanging inside their apartments.
Yeah, I do think you have regional differences in what areas you want to push back about government overreach, because I think there's areas in the South that I think people are probably a little more pro government overreach, and vice versa with the West and the Northeast and what have you. That's just kind of how people are. Everyone's kind of hypocritical in some instances.
You think so?
So yeah, for a lot of the South, that was almost a rallying cry, is not wearing a mask.
Yeah.
I guess maybe even more just conservatives in general, mask mandates and government overreach, pushing back on that. But there's a lot of other areas where the government has tons of overreach, and different parties and different people are fine with it depending on how it impacts them.
Well, I would say here close to home, here in Alabama, we tend to hate the federal government, but we love the federal government's money.
Hey, 7 out of 10 of the states getting the most aid are GOP states.
Yeah, so it's because we frankly have a lot of federal facilities. Take a look at Good Night. We have Maxwell Air Force Base and Fort Rucker down in Enterprise, and then we have the huge DoD complex up in Huntsville, and that's really where a good chunk of it is. In terms of a state our size of population, what have you, we do have more military installations than you can shake a stick at, and that's where I think a ton of that comes. But then again, people in Vermont probably don't want to have all those military installations up there. Regardless, I digress and all that stuff. However, when I saw this past weekend, when I saw people wearing masks, I was wondering to myself, what are you trying to prevent? And I say that understanding that they are obviously trying not to get sick and all that stuff. But when you really think about it, a thin gossamer sort of type mask, these tend appear to be N95s in the 110 degree heat index. It's kind of the flimsy blue, sort of what your dental hygienist wears. Is that really going to stop a virus that can mutate at will?
I'm not a scientist, but I think the easy answer and most of the data is backed up that no, can't really.
So so if you're going to go out and be amongst other sweaty people who are perspiring in the heat, does a mask really make any sense at all?
No, I think it's more, I think, again, pointing to the human condition. People do things and make them feel better that don't really have much actual impact, almost like a placebo.
So let me ask you this one. Imagine we do get down to a point where COVID comes roaring back and all that stuff, and they try to lock down the economy again. What do you do?
Me personally?
Yeah.
Nothing really differently. I mean, as far as what I'm already doing right now.
What do you think businesses will do?
I do not think it'll go over as easily as it did in 2020, because I think for so many people, I mean, pandemics are it's not an every decade thing like a recession tends to be. It's not something you can kind of. I had never even. I mean, swine flu was the closest thing I had to compare it to.
Swine flu?
Which was not.
Jerry Ford's a big deal?
I mean, but again, like, this isn't something I even knew what to compare it to deal with.
And in truth, no one really knew what to compare it to.
Right, which means people are more likely to go with government overreach. And I think that's intentional. Was it Rahm Emanuel saying don't let any good crisis go to waste? If there was to be something anywhere similar, and I do kind of have concerns about that, because what if it's something a lot more serious than COVID next time around? Not that COVID wasn't serious and killed a lot of people, but what if it's something that you really do need to stay in the house?
Contemporary
like
equivalent of
plague.
Black Death.
Yeah.
Where people didn't know what was people just dying. Just all over the place.
So again, I have concerns about that, and I have more concerns about again the psychological damage it's caused to people in their association with medicine and
the economic damage, the amount of money that we've had to borrow that we're never going to be able to pay back, and frankly, just some of the inequalities that it generated.
Yeah.
I mean, the people that really benefited the most out of the PPP programs, what have you, business owners and other sort of wealthier type people. People on the lower end of the totem pole were able to keep their jobs, but all of a sudden, there seemed to be a lot of money sloshing about, and
housing, money sloshing around, inflation. Again, I keep hitting back, but if you're not giving your dogs vaccines for rabies and things like that, because you are now so anti-vaccine and things that actually have been tested, unlike the COVID vaccines, that's concerning for the next time around.
Yeah.
That's concerning if people all of a sudden start not giving their dogs rabies vaccine.
Well, to that end, the president recently came out and said something about there's another booster to get for COVID and all that stuff. And I hate to tell you this, I'm not some big anti-vaxxer. I think, it frustrates me when I start seeing things like there are cases of leprosy in the United States or something along those lines. And a huge chunk of that is just due to the limited number of vaccine makers we truly do have.
Yeah.
That's due to a lot of governmental mismanagement of the whole vaccination process and production process. And please, by all means, go Google it yourself and all that stuff. You can Google it, I think I know. And but when you take a look at it, here's the president out there saying, hey, you need to go get this. Politics aside, I was like, I'm not going to go get another shot.
Yeah.
And that's just me. I'm not going to go get another shot. I didn't get COVID. Hadn't had COVID before I got vaccinated. I got vaccinated, and then I got COVID.
Yeah.
And crazy things, people, well, it could have been a lot worse. I don't know. The thing is, all of a sudden I'm vaccinated and I still get it. And I think a lot of other people felt the same way.
Yeah.
I got vaccinated and then I got COVID. I hadn't had COVID, and the truth is, how can you really completely vaccinate for this?
Well, one, you can't. I don't think really, and I think the
most recent virus.
Most recent mutation they said is already so different from the latest booster that it's probably going to be ineffective. But even on top of that, the companies that manufacture vaccines or medicines as a whole, the buzzword or a buzzword lately has been windfall taxes.
Yeah.
How does that? The whole industry is built around hitting these grand slams. The biotech industry, pharmaceuticals.
Listen, it's the same thing with the energy industry.
It's the same thing. I think
with every industry.
I think the best comparison is, honestly, this may not make sense to everyone, but it's venture capital, where a lot of money goes to waste. All you need, the successful funds, the successful biotech and pharmaceutical companies come out with a few drugs or even one drug that just blows it out of the water, whether it's studying mRNA vaccines, whether it's curing a kind of a niche disease or even curing certain types of cancer. If you start disincentivizing that, that's the only incentive. It's not to hit a bunch of singles because you're going to have a lot of strikeouts that offset more so than any singles. You would have to have those.
And so when politicians start talking about that in boom or bust sort of type industries like pharmaceuticals and even E&P, exploration, production, and the energy industry, they don't seem to get it, in my estimation, because you're absolutely right. In venture capital, what you just said, I mean, you can take an investor that has $200,000 to invest. They put $100,000 into project A, put $100,000 into project B. What happens? Project A, real chance it goes under, so that's a zero right there.
Yeah.
Lose $100,000. That's a four-bagger with Project B. So
Yeah.
meaning that $200 is now $400,000. And let's say they do that over 3 years. That's a 24% annualized rate of return. Who doesn't take that?
Right.
However, there's real risk involved with that. It's the same thing with drug pipelines and the amount of time that the FDA ordinarily holds things up. It's the same thing when you're wildcatting. It's not really the word, but when you're exploring for energy, there's a real probability that the wells that you're drilling are, if not dry, they just aren't producing at a level that is going to make them profitable. So, that's when you need to have a few home runs, and in order to recoup your losses, and in order to make money. So, by the way, you can have a pipeline moving forward.
It's like if I let you flip a coin and you lost $100 of his heads and you gained $100 of his tails. But I said, but if you win and you get tails and win $100, we're going to take 90% of that, 80% of that. So you have a chance to lose 100, and even though you won, get punished and gain 20. Would you do that?
Of course not. The odds are,
Right.
the odds are against me.
Overwhelmingly.
Yeah, so I'd say it's 50-50. I have a 50-50, just your prop stats class. If I can win $20, so I'd say, well, that's still 50%. So I've got my upside's $10 and my downside's $50.
Yeah.
Why would I do that?
Yeah.
It's the same thing I remember years ago, and I don't know if they've done it since, but the Swedish rock group ABBA, or not even rock group, the pop group ABBA. You ever heard of them?
Sounds familiar.
Okay. Oh my.
When were they around?
They were around before you were born, without a doubt.
80s?
That's just now 70s.
Way before us.
Well, they Dancing Queen and a few other tunes. That's
Oh, yeah. Mamma Mia song.
Yeah, Mamma Mia. Well, there you go. That's how you know ABBA. Ben and Bjorn, the Bees, and ABBA actually wrote that, but clearly a digression. At one point, they were, this was probably 15 years ago, they were offered something like $1 billion to go on a world tour, and they turned it down. And people go, how can you turn down $1 billion to do this? And they would have made that up in buckets. How did you turn down $1 billion? I said, so one, we've got all the money we need, and then two, the highest marginal tax rate in Sweden was Swedish residents, and whatever the tax rate system was at the time, they were going to be getting fractional pennies of that because there's so much money that virtually all of it was going to be taxed at the highest marginal tax rate, and just wasn't worth the trouble to them. And that's the problem when people have windfall taxes and what have you. Then gee whiz, all of a sudden you're not going to get the same level of overall economic activity if there's not any money to be made in it.
Yeah.
Now, with that being said, I think you're probably right. I think the next time the government says anything about shutting down the economy or sheltering in place, which is a stupid phrase, by the way. I hated it at the time. I hate it even more now. Where else are you going to shelter?
Yeah.
Outside? Well, that's
Not sheltering.
That's not sheltering. So, in any event, if Kay Ivey still government, she tries to lock down the economy again, no one's going to listen to her.
No.
Whoever comes up next, no one's going to listen to her, and there aren't enough law enforcement officers in the state in order to shut down every single business that is open for business. And that'll just be what happens.
Yeah.
People are just going to say, I'm not going to listen to you.
And I think you'll have more states push back against federal mandates as well. I think we saw a little bit of that during COVID. I think that's going to be, there's a quicker playbook to point to as far as that goes this time around.
So let's, it's. I think we're both on the same page here. One, we don't necessarily think we're going to have the same mandates, but two, they won't be anywhere near as impactful moving forward because people just aren't going to put up with them. Let me kind of take maybe the last question I have of you. Do you think moving forward, given what I think is proven to be federal government inefficiency, we'll just call it that, inefficiency on every time there's a crisis, or government inefficiency every time there's a crisis, and the mandates that lead to the crises or the inefficiencies and what have you. Do you think at some point your generation will just sit there and say, what are we thinking? Why are we giving this entity all this money and all this power when it's proven time and time again it's not as efficient, nor is it as well-meaning or all-loving or what have you as we thought that it was?
I think you're starting to see, and I hope this answers your question, more pushback. I think my jerk reaction was to say no, that we're going to continue to go down that road. But I think there's more and more voices that are, gaining a following, talking about defunding organizations, and I think some is probably justified and others definitely aren't. I think of defunding the police is probably what people think of when you say the word defunding now. Obviously, I don't think that is something that we need to go down, and that's not the governmental overreach that I'm referring to. But you're seeing people talk about it with the Fauci's organization, with the Department of Energy, the Department of Education, things like that. I think you're seeing more and more people start to push back on the amount of money that some of these government organizations have spent, and the lack of, for lack of a better word, the lack of fruit that we've seen from those actions. So I maybe the tide is changing a little bit, and I don't think I can say that confidently. I don't know what you think.
I would hope that is the case. It's not that there's not a role for government. It's not that there's not a role for the government should play in terms of its economies of scale and what have you. However, every time you take a look, and kind of going back to 18 years ago when Katrina ripped through Louisiana and Mississippi. Mississippi oftentimes gets overlooked for the damage that was done there. Everyone talks about New Orleans, but the folks in Pascagoula and Biloxi and Gulfport will tell you it was pretty brutal for them too. When you saw the combined governmental response, how poor it was. We saw the hand-handedness with how we treated the pandemic, in my estimation, but the state, local, and federal level. When we take a look at what's happened with this wildfires out, even out in Maui, and government entities refusing to release water, and just crazy things. The more and more you read about it, the more you're going, what's going on? And the way that we manage, timberland and what have you on federal property that leads to greater kindling on the ground that burns much more quickly. I can go through all of it. To me, and you know where I sit. I mean, in terms of how I view the world, very much as with an economic lens, with a business lens, and increasingly far more libertarian is sort of my day in and day out. I don't care what you do at your house, just as long as it doesn't impact me, I don't care.
Yeah.
So when I'm taking a look at it, that's how I wish the remainder of the world really kind of operated. Because I think we'd be happier as opposed to using government to either impose our own personal will on someone or to have this large leviathan tell us how we should think, behave, and what have you. Unfortunately, I think there's going to be fewer and fewer people of us as relative to the overall size of the population. Maybe not fewer. I don't know if we can get enough people to stop the avalanche that I think is governmental overreach.
Yeah, and why I wasn't so confident is that it seems like a pendulum, the way just society moves as a whole. And, maybe we're getting towards the end of it moving to one side, but it still seems to be moving in that direction. I don't think we've seen enough resistance to say it's confidently stopping its way in the other direction.
So there you have it. So I guess if you had to kind of add it all up and put it in a cocktail glass and shaker and all that stuff, and sit there and say that, people might not like the next mask mandate or shutdown of the local economies and all that stuff, but it could be very regionalized in terms of how people respond to that. I think here in the Deep South, where we are, people are just going to ignore. However, I'm not so sure people will ignore the same mandates in places like California or Illinois, New York, or much of New England, which seems to have been more tolerant of big government just in general. So
at least with this.
At least with this. So I don't know exactly what it's going to look like the next time there's a pandemic. I just hope that whatever response the government has is more efficient than it was last time, but I do think we can agree on that.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah, fingers crossed. All right, guys, thank you all so much for listening. We always love to hear from you all. So if you have any comments or questions, please, by all means, let us know. You can always drop us a line at tradingperspectives@oakworth.com, or you can leave us a review on the podcast outlet of your choice. As always, if you're interested in reading more, hearing more, what we have to say or how we think, you can always go to oakworth.com, take a look underneath the Thought Leadership tab, and find all kinds of exciting information, including links to previous podcasts, links to our blog /newsletter Common Sense, as well as links to our quarterly magazine, Macro and Market, as well as other analytical reports and what have you from our investment committee here at Oakworth. All right, Sam, we got anything else to say on this topic?
That's all I got.
That's all I've got today, too. Y'all take care.